The movie begins inside a rehab center, where a group of recovering addicts sits in a circle, sharing their personal experiences. A nurse enters and interrupts the session, announcing an urgent phone call for one of the women, Darby. When Darby takes the call, a relative informs her that her mother has suffered an aneurysm and is currently in a hospital in Salt Lake City, with her sister Devin by her side. Filled with concern, Darby immediately asks the rehab manager to let her leave, but the request is denied. The manager reminds her that just a week ago, she faked an emergency about her mother being in a car accident in an attempt to escape, so he doubts her sincerity this time. He also warns that if she tries to run away again, she'll face jail time. Frustrated, Darby goes to her room. Later that night, Darby secretly contacts her sister, Devin, and it becomes clear that their relationship is strained. Devin bluntly tells Darby she doesn't want to see her and can't deal with two issues at once, hinting at Darby's troubled past with addiction. Despite this cold response, Darby is determined to leave. She steals a screwdriver and hammer and uses them to break out of the rehab center, stealing Mickey's car in the process by hot wiring it. Inside the car, she discovers Mickey's phone and a small stash of drugs, revealing that the rehab worker is selling drugs at the center. As she drives away, Darby sends a text to her sister informing her of the escape. Soon, the stormy weather gets worse, and Devin replies, urging Darby not to come, warning that her arrival will only complicate things further. As the weather worsens, making it nearly impossible for Darby to continue driving, she pulls over to the side of the road. Holding a packet of drugs in her hand, she struggles with the temptation to use them. In this tense moment, a flashback reveals a painful memory from her past, where her mother and sister found her overdosed in a car. Suddenly, a police officer taps on her window, informing her that all the roads are closed due to an incoming storm and advises her to wait it out at a nearby visitor center. Reluctantly, Darby agrees and drives to the center. Upon arrival, she finds a small group of people also stranded, waiting for the storm to pass. Seeking some privacy, Darby heads to the restroom, where she checks her messages and reads another disheartening text from her sister, again telling her not to come to the hospital. Overwhelmed, she pulls out a small bag of cocaine but ultimately chooses not to use it. Later, Darby steps outside to the parking lot, hoping to find phone service. As she walks, she hears a strange noise and follows it, only to discover a young child tied up inside a van. Panicked, she tries to open the door, but it's locked. Thinking quickly, she takes a photo of the van's license plate and reassures the child that she'll return. After heading to her car, Darby attempts to call 911, but there's no signal. Frustrated, she goes back inside the visitor's center, scanning the room and coming to a chilling realization whoever kidnapped the child must be among the people there. After sitting back down, Darby is introduced to the others: Sandy, a former nurse, her husband Ed, a retired Marine, Lars, an awkward and socially uncomfortable man, and Ash, who seems friendly and charming. To pass the time, Ed suggests they play a card game, and everyone joins in. While playing, Darby casually asks questions about where everyone is from and where they're headed, but her real goal is to figure out which one of them is the kidnapper. Her suspicions grow when she notices that the van's license plate is from Nevada, and Lars, the socially awkward one, mentions he's from Nevada too. Darby becomes tense, especially as Lars, frustrated with losing the game, starts showing signs of mental instability. Seizing a chance, Darby excuses herself and slips into an out-of-order restroom, hoping to contact 911 about the kidnapped child. She even sends a picture of the van's license plate, but still, there's no cell service. Realizing she'll have to act on her own, Darby decides to take matters into her own hands. Using a hammer, she pries a wooden plank from the wall, revealing a crawl space she can fit through. She sneaks around the building and makes her way back to the van. This time, she manages to unlock the door using a thin metal bar and climbs inside. As she works to untie the child, she notices a medical alert bracelet on the child's wrist. Suddenly, Lars enters the van, forcing Darby to quickly hide under a blanket. Lars then starts speaking gently to the child, revealing that the child's name is Jay. Lars moves to the back of the van to cover the windows with cardboard, and in that moment, Darby notices he has a gun tucked into his back pocket. Once seated again, Lars starts talking about a man named Uncle Kenny, explaining that he's planning to deliver Jay to him. He then leaves the van, saying he's going to get some snacks for Jay. Knowing time is running out, Darby quickly gives Jay a box cutter for protection before sneaking out of the van and slipping back into the restroom. Outside, Lars spots footprints in the snow near the van and grows suspicious. At the same time, Ash, concerned, begins knocking on the restroom door to check on Darby. Just as Darby is about to tell him what's really happening, Lars appears. Thinking fast, Darby pretends she and Ash were just making out to cover up the situation. Feeling uneasy, Lars leaves, giving Darby the chance to tell Ash about the young girl tied up in the van and how Lars likely suspects she's onto him. Ash looks alarmed and grabs a nail gun from a nearby tool cart. He quickly devises a plan. Darby will step outside again, making sure Lars follows her, while Ash stays behind to inform Ed, the ex-Marine, about the situation. However, when Darby sneaks back into the van, Jay innocently asks where the men who took her are, revealing that more than one kidnapper is involved. Alarmed, Darby looks outside and sees Ash and Lars talking together. To her shock, Ash takes the handgun, and Lars grabs the nail gun they're both in on the kidnapping, planning to ambush her. Darby manages to sneak back into the building, and when Ash and Lars check the van and find her missing, they return inside as well. Ash finds Darby, corners her, and takes her phone. He deletes the unsent messages she had tried to send to 911 earlier and reads through the messages from her sister. He discovers that Darby's family has a strained relationship with her and doesn't want her to come to the hospital. Meanwhile, Ed, growing suspicious of the situation, steps outside to investigate. Inside, Ash starts grilling Darby with probing questions about her family. He even inquires about how her father died, and a terrified Darby reveals that her father committed suicide by shooting himself. Ash then coldly presses the gun to Darby's head, asking her morbid questions about which part of her father's head was shot. Darby, horrified, accuses him of being a child molester. In response, Ash coldly explains that he's doing this for the money, revealing that Jay's wealthy father would pay a substantial ransom for her safe return. He also mentions that Jay has Addison's disease, which could make her overdose on adrenaline, so Darby's attempts to save her might not make a difference. Meanwhile, inside the van, Jay has started using the box cutter Darby left her to cut through the duct tape binding her. Just then, Ed approaches the van and starts trying to open the door, making Jay freeze in fear, thinking it's one of her captors. As Ash and Darby talk, they're interrupted by Sandy, who asks to speak with Darby privately. Before leaving, Ash threatens Darby, warning her not to tell anyone about what's happening or he will kill everyone. Terrified, Darby keeps silent, even though Sandy can see she's visibly shaken. Darby shifts the conversation to brain aneurysms, asking Sandy about her mother's chances of survival. After their brief discussion, Darby and Sandy return to the front hall and rejoin the group of men. Soon, Darby notices that Jay has managed to free herself from the van and is making a run for it. Ash and Lars spot Jay too, and Lars rushes outside to chase her. Meanwhile, Ed and Sandy remain oblivious to the unfolding situation. Darby heads back to the restroom, prompting Ash to excuse himself and follow her. As soon as Ash enters the room, Darby ambushes him with a hammer and a violent struggle ensues. Despite her efforts, Ash's strength gives him the upper hand, and he begins to choke Darby. Just in time, Lars arrives and stops Ash from causing further harm. Lars informs Ash that the child has escaped to a hiking trail and insists they need to pursue her. Reluctantly, the kidnappers force Darby to join them in the search, unaware that she has secretly stolen their car keys. As they hike along the trail searching for the child, Darby refuses to cooperate. She uses a flashlight to blind Ash and Lars, then jumps down a hill to escape. In response, Ash fires his gun at her, but she dodges the shots and ends up rolling down the hill. Back at the building, Ed and Sandy hear the gunshot, and Ed rushes outside. Darby hides as Ash and Lars search for her, and she manages to remain out of sight. Meanwhile, Ed discovers Jay, who is unconscious, and quickly carries her back inside. Upon seeing Jay's medical alert bracelet, Ed and Sandy realize the child has a serious medical condition. Just then, Darby returns to the building and explains the situation to them. Ash and Lars soon arrive at the front of the building, shouting for the group to hand over the child or they will all be killed. To buy time, Ed barricades the front door with chairs and warns that he will shoot if they try to get inside. The kidnappers hesitate, debating whether or not Ed is bluffing. Inside, it's revealed that Ed doesn't actually have a gun. The kidnappers quickly change their strategy, claiming that Jay is ill and they have her medication. Sandy, the former nurse, starts to waver. She argues that the kidnappers might be telling the truth since Jay looks so pale and could die. Ed and Darby refuse to give in to the kidnappers' demands. Darby reveals that she has stolen their car keys, offering a new bargaining chip. Seizing the opportunity, Ed shouts at the kidnappers, proposing to trade the medication for the car keys. Furious, Ash and Lars retreat to their van, but instead of bringing the medication, they come out with a gas can, threatening to burn down the building. Ed instructs Darby to hide the car keys, reasoning that the kidnappers won't be able to harm them if they can't escape. Meanwhile, the kidnappers start dousing the building's exterior with gasoline. Inside, Sandy, visibly scared, arms herself with pepper spray, preparing for the worst. During the chaos, Jay wakes up and calls out for Sandy, revealing that they know each other. A flashback shows Sandy working as a maid in Jay's home, where Jay used to bully her. The flashback also reveals that when Jay was being kidnapped and screaming for help, Sandy did nothing to intervene. Another scene shows Sandy on the phone with Ash, who angrily demands she find the girl's medication and bring it to them, threatening that Jay will die if she doesn't comply. Back in the present, Sandy, overwhelmed by the situation, shouts out that her husband doesn't actually have a gun. In a panic, she pepper sprays Darby, and the kidnappers finally manage to enter the building. Ash hands Sandy the medication and instructs her to give it to Jay. Once that's done, tensions escalate between Sandy, Ash, and Lars. Sandy admits that she helped the kidnappers abduct Jay in exchange for a share of the ransom money. Ed is stunned and deeply disappointed to learn this, realizing that the whole trip was a setup to collect the ransom. Darby then reveals a shocking truth. Ash and Lars never intended to return Jay to her parents and have no interest in the ransom money. They're actually part of a child trafficking ring scheme and plan to sell Jay to someone else. Sandy, horrified, pleads with them not to go through with it, but is too scared to resist. In a desperate move, she tells them to take the child and leave. She also reveals that Darby has hidden the car keys outside. When Darby and Ed refuse to hand over the car keys, Ash reacts by shooting Ed. Sandy, in a desperate attempt to help, sprays Lars with pepper spray, but is shot in the process. Darby reaches for the pepper spray on the ground, but Ash beats her to it. He then approaches Sandy, who is still alive, and finishes her off. Ash drags Darby to a wall and nails her wrist on the wall with a nail gun. Meanwhile, Lars, crying from the pepper spray, is taken to the restroom by Ash to clean up, leaving Darby pinned to the wall. In agony, Darby tries to pull her wrist free but is unable to due to the pain. She spots a hammer nearby, but it's too far out of reach. Desperate, she decides to call for Jay's help. Meanwhile, Ash is assisting Lars in getting the pepper spray out of his eyes. Lars is visibly shaken and distressed, having not anticipated that Ash would resort to killing anyone. Jay manages to pass the hammer to Darby, but just as Darby begins to use it, Ash and Lars return to the room. Darby quickly hides the hammer. Ash approaches her, demanding once more to know the location of the car keys. He then opens Darby's phone and reads a new text message, leaning in to tell her that her mother has just passed away in the hospital. Overwhelmed with grief, Darby can only cry quietly in response. At this point, the weather has improved enough for mobile signals to work again, allowing the 911 text Darby sent earlier to be received. The police are now on their way. Faced with this new urgency, Ash and Lars become increasingly desperate. Ash grabs Jay by the arm, threatening to nail her wrist to the wall if Darby doesn't reveal the location of the car keys. Desperate to save Jay, Darby reluctantly discloses that the keys are buried in the snow outside the bathroom. Ash hands the gun to Lars and heads outside to find the keys. It's evident that Lars is deeply unsettled by the violence and is not comfortable with what's happening. Seizing the moment, Darby devises a new plan. She instructs Jay to turn off the light switch, knowing that Lars is less violent than Ash and wouldn't hurt her. Despite her fear, Jay follows Darby's instructions. Lars, now panicking, shouts at Jay to sit back down. Darby uses this distraction to pull out a small bag of cocaine from her pocket and snorts it, hoping to numb her pain. Once Jay turns off the lights, Darby seizes the opportunity to pry the nail out of her wrist. Meanwhile, Lars is having difficulty trying to catch Jay. When the lights come back on, Darby swiftly attacks Lars with a hammer. Ash returns to the room and finds Darby holding Lars at gunpoint. It's clear from Ash's nervous demeanor that he is deeply concerned about Lars. Jay tries to disarm Ash by knocking the nail gun from his grasp, but in the commotion, Ash accidentally fires the nail gun, shooting Lars in the forehead. Overwhelmed with guilt and shock, Ash rushes to help Lars, while Darby and Jay sneak outside and get into Darby's car. As Ash attempts to assist Lars, he slips on the blood on the floor, causing the nail to embed even deeper into Lars's head, ultimately killing him. With Lars dead, Ash is consumed by rage. He storms outside and starts shooting at Darby's car, blowing out a tire and causing her to lose control and crash. As Darby struggles to regain her bearings, Ash decides to set the building on fire. As he approaches Darby's wrecked car, an officer arrives and orders him to step away from the vehicle. Fully conscious now, Darby grabs a screwdriver and a gun and exits the car. She shoots at Ash, but now the officer perceives her as a threat and shoots her in the gut. Ash, still alive, takes the gun from Darby and shoots him. He then turns to Darby, aiming the gun at her, but finds it's out of bullets. Nearby, Ash realizes the officer is still alive, so he grabs the nail gun and finishes him off. He then takes the officer's gun and returns to kill Darby. However, Darby stabs him in the throat with the screwdriver, ending his life. Using her remaining strength, Darby crawls through the snow to reach the dead officer's radio and calls for help before collapsing. In the next scene, Darby is back at the rehab center, and it's been over a month since the incident. A child's drawing on the wall in her room indicates she is kept in touch with Jay. A nurse knocks on her door to announce a visitor. Darby heads to the lobby and finds her sister, Devon, there, ready to reconcile and fix things. Darby smiles in relief, and that's where the movie ends. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more recaps. See you in the next one.